On the podcast this week, Ken Vogel on his book, Devil's Advocates, the hidden story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payrolls of corrupt foreign interests. Mr. Vogel covers the confluence of money, politics, business, and influence for the New York Times. He was interviewed by Doug Sovern, a former political reporter for KCBS in San Francisco.
Giving Tuesday is coming, a global day to support the causes that matter most. I'm Paul from C-SPAN, and if open access to your government matters to you, you don't have to wait. Make your Giving Tuesday gift to C-SPAN today. We bring you live, unfiltered coverage of Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court, so you can access your government without spin or commentary. C-SPAN is nonprofit, commercial-free, and receives no government funding. We're powered by listeners like you. Make your Giving Tuesday gift now at cspan.org/donate. And thank you for supporting C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
Ken, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you for having me, Doug, and thank you for the Commonwealth Club for doing this.
So let's start by, this book is chock full of characters and complex situations that add up to a really fascinating tale of shady business that many Americans probably don't know anything about or very little. But before we dig into some of those details, and there's some really savory and unsavory ones, can we go back to the beginning of how this whole industry of Americans getting paid handsomely to lobby for foreign interests got started? I mean, lobbying has been around for centuries at this point, but this form of it dates to, I guess, around the 1930s. Is that accurate?
Yeah, certainly the effort to regulate it and the real public awareness of it and of it as a potential threat to the public discourse and to the public interest dates to the 1930s, and particularly to efforts by Adolf Hitler's regime, the Third Reich in Germany in the 1930s, to win over the American public, or at least to tamp down the rising opposition and concerns that were, for obvious reasons, starting to grip the American public. And so his regime paid a number of Americans, including people who were really at the fore of creating the modern public relations industry, to help essentially sugarcoat what was going on in Germany. And understandably, when this came to the attention of the U.S. Congress, it caused quite a stir. There were hearings, and eventually there was this Foreign Agents Registration Act that was passed and signed into law in the late 30s. It was and remains the main tool that the U.S. government and that the public and that the media have for really gaining any kind of visibility into these types of payments and what these consultants and public relations people and lobbyists are doing for the money.
Okay, so ultimately we know the Nazi regime was not successful, but did they succeed in the short term in changing public opinion and influencing public opinion in the U.S.? Yeah,
I mean, certainly there was a whole America First movement, right, ironically, called the America First movement in the 30s. That it wasn't like necessarily. I mean, there were certainly elements of it that were sort of pro-Hitler, pro-German, but it was mostly intended to reduce the appetite in the U.S. for going to war, for the U.S. entering World War II. And there were quite prominent people who were involved. Charles Lindbergh, others in American public life. However, a lot of this was being coordinated by these people behind the scenes who were the public relations folks and the lobbyists, what we would now think of as lobbyists, who were on the payroll of the Third Reich and of German companies that were closely associated with the Third Reich, so they could have essentially some plausible deniability that they weren't working directly for the Third Reich, but really they were doing the bidding of the Third Reich and did have some effect, at least initially. Obviously, Pearl Harbor and the rising distaste for what became the Holocaust was more significant than any public relations could possibly seek to spin.
Yeah, that would be hard for even the most seasoned PR man to overcome. All right, so in the middle of all this, Congressman Dick Steen, I think is how you say his name, he is up in arms and proposes what eventually becomes the Foreign Agents Registration Act. But you reported an extraordinary piece of information about him in this book. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, sure. He, at the time, was on the payroll of the Russians. He was actually a Russian agent, unregistered, unknown, secret Russian agent. Of course, the Russians at the time were averse to the Nazis and the Germans. So in some way, and he was accused in real time of like doing, this is unnecessary, and this is just like anti-German sentiment being fomented by the Russians. And he brushed that off, but there may have been an element of truth to that. And like I say, he was later determined as a result of some very effective and interesting research done in the Kremlin archives by American researchers that showed his case file. Essentially, this is a sitting U.S. congressman who was on the payroll of the Kremlin. It wasn't until many years later that this came out, but it's as ironic and maybe sort of telling sort of endnote or epilogue to the creation of the current the modern regime for applying transparency to foreign lobbying, that one of the authors of it was himself violating the sort of the intent of this law. And I think that does go to show how difficult it can be for any type of law or regulatory regime to really sleuth out and give Americans a clear sense of who is doing, who's bidding when it comes to foreign influence in U.S. politics and government.
So he went to his grave with his secret intact, right? I mean, this came out decades later.
Yeah, that's right. And then, he's from I think he's from somewhere in New York, maybe the Bronx. And there were like streets named after him, and there were retroactive posthumous efforts once this came out to remove his name from various streets and public institutions, because he was exposed as a fraud and essentially doing something that was anathema to what his public persona was based on.
That's incredible. All right, so the whole book could just be that, except that, as we now see, we flash forward to the well, not the present yet. Let's go to the 1970s, and this whole industry, if we want to call it that, blossoms under the leadership of Paul Manafort, Roger Stone. Tell us how they took this to a whole new level and how that eventually leads us to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that there's always been obviously an interest. So that's one of the conceits of the book, that there's always been an interest by foreign powers or politicians or companies or interest groups to shape U.S. Foreign affairs and just the exercise of U.S. power on the world stage. But that really came to a head during the Cold War. And as the Cold War intensified, there were efforts by foreign regimes to sort of stay in the good graces of the United States. And the way that they did that was by casting themselves as sort of bulwarks against communism and wherever their part of the world was. And so it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to convince the U.S. government that you are worthy of essentially being on the good side of the U.S. and continuing to receive, whether it's U.S. foreign aid or military assistance to fight communism, all of which is like quite valuable for domestically for, some of these interests and leaders in different parts of the world to be able to show like, look, we're on the good side of the U.S. and we're getting all this support, and for the countries themselves. And so in a lot of cases, there were, some of these countries and leaders who were trying to cast themselves as anti-communist stalwarts were like quite oppressive and brutal in their, to their constituents or in their home countries. And so they needed assistance in sort of making the case and whitewashing their reputations in Washington. And Paul Manafort had kind of pioneered this sort of type of lobbying / political consulting industry on the domestic front in the U.S., where he and Roger Stone and Charlie Black had worked as campaign consultants for Reagan, before that for Ford, and had helped elect these candidates, not just to the White House, but in Congress and, really up and down the ballot. And then they realized, like we can make a lot of money as political consultants, but we can really make a lot of money once we help elect these people by lobbying them on behalf of even more deep-pocketed corporate interests. And so they had a saying, they had this office in Old Town Alexandria, not far from where I'm sitting right now, where they, overlooking the Potomac River, the very sort of latest of 1970s and 80s, I guess it'd be 80s fashion and office aesthetics. And they had 2 floors, one of which was the political consulting floor, the other was the lobbying floor. They say we elect them on the 3rd floor and then we lobby them on the 4th floor. Maybe I have that reversed. But anyway, this was like a real innovation in American political consulting. And what Manafort in particular realizes, like, okay, look, this is a very profitable thing. And there was interest from large multinational conglomerates in buying their firm or in replicating this model. But he realized, like, this could be even more lucrative if we did this on the world stage. So that entails both, like, you know, you've elected these U.S. representatives, and so now you're lobbying for members of Congress, but you could also lobby for foreign regimes or foreign companies and foreign interests. And oftentimes they had even more money at their disposal, both because they didn't have the same sort of transparency requirements, so they felt more comfortable throwing more money at this type of lobbying. But also that, like, in a lot of cases, these were like ill-gotten fortunes. These were like autocrats and dictators and oligarchs who made their money by essentially privatizing, particularly in the post-communist world, by privatizing assets from the state or just by stealing from the public resources in their country, wherever that country was. And so they had a lot of money to throw around. And there was like a higher like opportunity cost, like reputational risk for these lobbyists in the U.S. who were then going to seek to win favor in Washington on their behalf. So, like, if they're going to take a client who could potentially be toxic and damage their own reputation, it better be worth their while in terms of financial remuneration. And it certainly was. So Manafort introduced that piece of it. And then he even introduced even a further innovation where he was decided like he would actually run some of these campaigns for these foreign figures, politicians, in some cases guerrilla leaders. He would help elect them. Then he would lobby for them in Washington, while at the same time helping elect the figures in Washington for, who he was lobbying on behalf of these foreign interests. So he really had like all phases of this covered, and this became a profitable model that other consulting firms, lobbyists, and political operatives sought to replicate. And it really marked the professionalization of this industry, which was sort of simmering there for a while, but didn't really have a well-established sort of set of rules and guidelines and characters until Paul Manafort came along and really turbocharged it.
So it's not even just double dipping; it can be triple dipping. I'll charge you $1 million to get you elected, then I'll charge that guy. I'll get that guy elected over there for even more because he's got oil money or stolen money or whatever, and then I will charge him to lobby you, who I just helped get elected, so you feel beholden to me. I mean, it's an incredible scheme, but incredibly, all of it is essentially legal as long as you register as a lobbyist, report that you're a foreign agent, right? You're not breaking any laws.
Yeah, that's right. And we can get to Manafort and the degree to which he sort of found that out the hard way. But first, I'll tell like one story that I think is really emblematic of his success on this front and the effectiveness of it, which involves this Jonas Savimbi. He's a guerrilla leader in Angola who was fighting the Angolan government. The Angolan government was backed by the Cubans. So Savimbi, who's just a real brutal figure who would, kill like dissenters even on his own side in public, like torture rituals. The U.S. government was found him a very distasteful figure, but Manafort brought him to Washington. This guy is, charismatic. He spoke like multiple languages. He wore a beret with his fatigues. But was like a Paris educated at the Sorbonne, sort of compelling figure. And Manafort brought him to Washington and made him like a cause célèbre among the anti-communist conservatives during the Reagan years. And ended up making millions of dollars from his organization. It was called UNITA. I don't know that it's I think maybe a Portuguese acronym that I'm not going to try to get. But there are subsequently many lawmakers and people who were supportive of UNITA and of Savimbi, subsequently said, like, later expressed regret for it and essentially said that, like, they kept the money flowing because Manafort had positioned this guy as like Reagan's freedom fighter in Africa. And I interviewed Manafort about this, and he basically admitted it. Like, yeah, this guy's like a deeply flawed character, and like he is not consistent with U.S. ideals as far as like democracy and human rights and religious freedom of expression. But he was consistent with the U.S. Sort of foreign policy imperatives on this one issue that was the overriding issue of the day, which was fighting communism and
Right.
during the Cold War. And so Manafort was willing to go to work for him, and he kept the working for him and kept the support flowing from the Reagan administration to the first Bush administration into the Clinton administration. And by the time this guy was killed, Savimbi, in 2002, there were hundreds of thousands of deaths in this Angolan civil war. That, again, there were people who were supportive of him who subsequently said that was like a bad decision and we were essentially duped into doing it. And it's not just Manafort. Obviously, there are serious U.S. foreign policy considerations here, but I think most people regard that in hindsight as a mistake and one that Manafort was like key in perpetuating, and believe that the Civil War would have ended a lot earlier were it not for continued U.S. support of Savimbi and his rebel movement in Angola.
So in that case, it sounds like Manafort actually got something done and that he got continued support for Savimbi. But in many cases in this book, whether it's Hunter Biden, Rudy Giuliani, Manafort, Robert Strick, who many of us didn't know much about before he's a central figure in the book, it seems like a lot of what they would do is take huge sums of money in return for a promise to help and then really not deliver or really not do anything. Or maybe, well, I tried, they would offer the illusion of influence as opposed to influence itself. I mean, is that a fair description?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, by the way, that's not unique to foreign lobbying. That's like a real feature of sort of influence peddling in Washington, this smoke and mirrors aspect. And part of it is, I say smoke and mirrors, and I think that is accurate, and that does describe some of what the lobbyists do, because it is in their interest to have some mystery around this and to not have their clients know like why a decision was made to allow them to claim credit for things that they didn't do, or even more to the point, and this is like a main sort of like goal or pursuit of lobbying, is like to stop something from happening that could have been bad. So there's a lot of that, a lot of defensive lobbying, and sometimes it may actually be true that they did stop a bill that would have, halted foreign aid or military assistance to a given regime that is a client of theirs. But it just so happens that, like, in this space, in the foreign lobbying and foreign influence space, I think that is even more effective. Both, it's effective that like you can actually have an effect on these outcomes, but it's even more effective in like claiming that you had an effect when you might not have, because in a lot of cases, these are not people who have like a ton of experience with the U.S. political system. And so instead, they tend to apply their perspective, like the way that things work in their country, to their sense of like how it works in the U.S. And that's why it's so effective, because in a lot of these countries, particularly the post-Soviet countries, but in, countries in parts of Africa or the Middle East or Asia, there are like very open pay-to-play cultures. There are very few laws, and if there are laws, they're widely ignored, that are intended to prohibit that. Obviously, in the U.S., we have a lot of laws that are intended to prohibit that kind of thing, and therefore we like to think that we're quite different above that sort of like pay-to-play politics. But these foreign interests are willing to believe, and these lobbyists are oftentimes encouraging the belief that like, no, it works the same way here. And what I found is like, in some cases, that perception is almost like enough. Like, sure, in some cases, they actually get things done and they stop a bad, something that's potentially harmful for the foreign client, or they get something that's useful for the foreign client. But in some cases, just the signaling of having a Hunter Biden or a Rudy Giuliani or a Paul Manafort on the payroll does deliver the value unto itself, because it's signaling to domestic rivals, whether they be in your own country, people who might be seeking to run against you, or whether they be regional rivals who are like looking to get one up on you in some kind of regional dispute. Like, look, I have someone who is very close to the president of the United States who's on my payroll. That is a strong signal. And if you can get them to appear with you, or to get to get you in a photo, a selfie with the president or with them, like that actually does go a long way. So even in the cases where it does appear to be more of a smoke and mirrors type of situation, there is still some value there that is derived by these foreign clients from throwing these huge sums of money at these well-connected Americans.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
That's an expensive selfie. So yeah, that's
Totally.
true. In many of those cultures, that perception is enough. Oh, he's his guy. So I mean, that may be enough. And I would guess, you know, eventually, if you don't deliver something, you lose the contract, they cut you off. And we see in the book lawsuits and recriminations and bad deals, they got to move on to another thing because something falls apart. When Donald Trump ran for president, he promised to get rid of this kind of thing, right? I seem to recall him saying we're no more foreign lobbying, something to that effect. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And his own family seems to be as enmeshed in it as anyone else, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that like initially when he came into office in 2017, it wasn't like a draining of the swamp, which is what he promised, but it was certainly a disruption because he was legitimately an outsider and he did not have connections to a lot of these traditional gatekeepers who populate K Street, which is the boulevard in Washington along which these lobbying firms were traditionally located. It's now a little more diffuse and they're spread out around town. But he didn't have connections to a lot of these types of people, the fundraisers, the lobbyists, the consultants, and the like. And so, in some ways, there was a bit of a void when he came into town. And so it created a vacuum into which people who had connections to him, even sometimes like, peripheral or fleeting connections to him, to rush in and, in some cases hang out a shingle for the first time and say, like, you want to know how this mysterious new disruptive president of the United States is going to treat, you or your country or people in your part of the world, you need to hire me. And I'm the person who can like show you, who can guide you through this new, this new Washington and can get you in good with this new Washington. And so the guy you mentioned, Robert Strick, who's the main character in the book, is definitely the personification of that. He had tried to break into lobbying at various times and political consulting, but had not had a ton of success. He's a Republican, and so he had been in Washington under the second Bush administration, and when Obama won, he basically lost all his business and moved out and did a bunch of other things. He purchased a winery. He was, he purchased, tried to purchase a security guard business. So sort of a serial entrepreneur, not a particularly successful one. But when Trump won, he was able to capitalize on this opportunity to become one of these new gatekeepers. And certainly there were a bunch of new people who came in, some of whom were quite close to Trump, including just his cronies in business. And they became the new swamp. And what we saw certainly a bit during the first Trump administration, but way more now, is a willingness to just engage in this kind of open transactionalism with these characters as either as players unto themselves or as brokers to foreign interest or domestic interest around the world that really empowered them in a way that was in some cases much more toxic and much more likely to precipitate the types of conflicts of interest that we typically seek to avoid with our ethics and conflict of interest laws. And so it was much more so than like a typical swamp, Trump swamp. And I think we're seeing that in a big way now in the second administration where it's not even just the people around. It's not even just the lobbyists. It's Trump's own family. Hell, it's Trump himself when it comes to the crypto stuff, where, his sons are going around the world and striking these deals with crypto interests, in a lot of cases, foreign crypto interests or foreign interests that are using the Trump crypto vehicles to finance their deals. And Trump himself is a stakeholder in the biggest firm, this World Liberty Financial. So it's really, turbocharging this sort of foreign influence space and showing in a lot more stark way, like what you can get for your money. And in some cases, it's not just like dinner with the president. It's like becoming a business partner with the president. And in the case of CZ, the founder of Binance, the Chinese-born founder of this Chinese started cryptocurrency trading platform, who was pursued by the U.S. government both during as part of a crackdown on crypto during the first Trump administration and then during the Biden administration, and pleaded guilty to failure to initiate money laundering preventative measures. Well, his firm financed the deal with the Emirati Sovereign Wealth Fund through this World Liberty Financial. And just a few months later, Trump turned around and pardoned him. And now he's able to get back into the U.S. Cryptocurrency market in a big way. So like that's an example of just going right to the top and skipping the traditional lobbyists and gatekeepers, and the degree to which something like that is possible under this brazenly transactional second Trump administration.
Yeah, and Trump said something like, "Oh, I don't even know him, but I hear he's a good guy. I heard some good things. So yeah, no, he didn't do anything wrong at all." And I mean, he pleaded guilty to whatever.
Right, he pleaded guilty. And it's not just pleaded guilty. I mean, he pleaded guilty. It sounds like sort of a paperwork violation, like failure to implement money laundering, preventative measures. But like his in the guilty plea, he's admitting that like this allowed like Hamas and ISIS and Al Qaeda to move money using his platform, and that his regulators and auditors internal were aware of this stuff. So, the idea that he did nothing wrong, the idea that Trump doesn't know him when his sons are basically in business with the guy, and the guy's appeared at various cryptocurrency forums with his sons, that his own company, Trump's own company, World Liberty Financial, is represented by a lawyer who also represents CZ and Binance and was lobbying for the pardon, as were CZ, also paid a hunting buddy and business partner of Donald Trump Jr., a guy by the name of Chess McDowell, to lobby for this pardon. So yeah, Trump definitely heard about this guy and heard that he didn't do things wrong from some people, but some people, I think it minimizes the degree to which this guy had really effectively navigated this new sort of Washington, where you're able to, if you pay the right people, like go right to the top and get your way.
Okay, so it's one thing for Hunter Biden to say, "I'll get you in with the big guy," or whatever, and get his dad on the phone, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. But in this case, you're talking about, like, as you say, Trump is actually directly involved in the deals. So is there no sense of hypocrisy or double standard at all? I mean, are they aware of it and we'll just ignore that? At the same time, they're blasting the Democrats for everything they can. I mean, how do you explain that discordance?
I'll read a quote. This is from Eric Trump, and it's actually, I didn't get this quote. This is a colleague of mine at the New York Times by the name of Ben Protest, who was writing about this very phenomenon, that being, particularly when it comes to crypto, but just generally the open transactionalism and the degree to which the Trump family is engaging in this time around. And so he asked Eric Trump about it, and Eric Trump said, "The first term, we did everything imaginable to avoid any appearance of impropriety. And frankly, we got crushed anyway." And then he argues that the presidency had cost his father the first time around an absolute fortune. And he says, "We can't sit out in perpetuity, and I won't," he added. "I'm not in government, I'm in private industry." So right there, you see the mindset, which is that, like, and by the way, I would take that with a grain of salt. The idea that during the first term they tried to play by the rules. I think maybe a little bit more. They certainly were sort of more aware of the criticism and like sensitive to the criticism. And, and he's basically admitting that, like, this time around, we're not even going to take those. You thought those, the critics sort of deemed the steps that they took in the first term to be insufficient, or to be like sort of like paying lip service to these norms and these mores about not engaging and not profiting off the presidency. Well, this time around, they're not even going to engage in the sort of
not even going to pretend.
Right. There's no fig leaf. The other thing I'll say that's like different, both in the foreign influence space and just the influence space generally with the second Trump administration versus the first. And I get into this in my book, is like, in the first administration, like, they were still doing business. The Trump organization was, and Trump himself, the president, said that he was not involved, that it was his sons. But, the Trump organization was still doing business. It was still, trying to do real estate deals in different parts of the world with different, deep-pocketed interests that had a real stake in the outcome of U.S. foreign policy that was overseen by their dad. But whether it was cases like that with real estate deals, or whether it was the, foreign interest staying at the Trump Hotel in Washington to try to curry favor, like, there was at least they were getting like something, you know what I mean? It was like a good or a service. It was a round of golf. It was a property deal. It was a stay in the hotel. It may have been overpriced. The meal at the BLT Prime and the lobby might not have been worth the amount that they paid for it, but there was something there that you could ascribe a value to in sort of a free market way. With the crypto stuff, it's really just putting money in the president's pocket and the pocket of his family and his allies, because the value is what the buyer sees it as. There's no like ascribed fixed value to something like that. And it's been the most profitable venture that the Trumps have engaged in decades, if not ever, perhaps because of that. I mean, do we really think that like any of these crypto ventures would be as successful if he wasn't the president? I mean, there's plenty of meme coins and plenty of, crypto sort of, brokerages that you could use that you could probably get better deals on but that don't carry the Trump name and the imprimatur of doing business with the president.
In case you're just joining us, we're talking with Ken Vogel. He's the author of Devil's Advocates, the hidden story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payrolls of corrupt foreign interests. But as you can hear, it gets into a lot more than just those characters in the book. You mentioned that you interviewed Paul Manafort and a lot of other players. How did you get them to talk to you? I mean, why were some of these people I know some weren't, but why were they willing to talk to you, knowing you're a reporter for the New York Times writing a book about this?
Well, I think just generally in some of these cases, given the dynamic that we talked about, where like the influence is in the eye of the beholder, a lot of these people have an interest in demonstrating like that they are effective and that they have connections, that they have juice. I think in Manafort's case, it was maybe a little bit different because, at the point when I was talking to him, he was just recently out of prison, by the way, for crimes that were connected to his unregistered foreign lobbying and his foreign political consulting work. He had gotten pardoned by Trump, and there was I think a little bit of legacy, sort of legacy bolstering instinct going on there that he wanted to and he was flattered. I mean, I've covered him for years, going back to when I was at Politico in 2009. I remember the first time that I sort of became aware of this foreign political consulting industry was right after the 2008 presidential election in the U.S., where a number of people who had worked in that election and previous elections had gone to Ukraine to work on the 2009 Ukrainian presidential election, including Manafort was one of them. Manafort was working for the guy who ended up winning, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the guy for whom he was working when he committed the crimes that led to his conviction, that led to his imprisonment. But in 2009, there were he had assembled a team that included Democrats who had worked on John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaign. There were people who had worked on the Obama campaign in 2008 who were working for a different candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko, and there was a third candidate who also had U.S. support U.S. consultants who were working for them. And so, it's something that Manafort was interested in showing, I pioneered this industry, and look at all that, and I worked across party lines, and maybe a little bit of spreading the blame as well. The pro-Russian Ukrainian politician who he was working for, he wanted to point out and did point out that I had prominent Democrats who were working for me for that same politician. And so anyway, I'd been covering him for years, Manafort, and I think there's a little bit also of that maybe he was a little flattered by my approach, where I said, I'm writing a book that's about this industry, and you are a formative figure in this industry, and I want to talk to you about what you did to sort of become that and shape this industry, and how you think it's changed and what have you. And so I think to some degree he was a little flattered, and his ego was sufficiently stroked that he felt comfortable sitting down and doing a couple interviews.
I'm sure you lobbied him effectively to get him to the interview, right? Has anyone, have you gotten any threats from this book coming out? Anybody suing you? Any, extreme negative reaction from anyone who doesn't like how they're portrayed?
We got some letters, my publishers did, threats that I probably shouldn't get into because they haven't yielded a lawsuit, and knock on wood, they hopefully won't. But I guess I could say Robert Strick, who's the main character, I know that he was not happy. I mean, I I went through all the fact checking with him, and he wasn't. I think that soured him a bit on his interactions with me. I haven't dealt with him much since, but I did hear from a mutual acquaintance who expressed to the strict displeasure with the book, not directly, but in that way. So, I think there is this element, with this type of lobbying where you want to show impact, and like all press is good press. So there's sort of a joke, when you write about like, the powerful lobbyists who did this horrible thing, and they're like, as long as the first two words are like
right.
powerful lobbyist and the picture is okay on the front of the New York Times, then like they're good with it. And so I think that's also part of like what explains the willingness of some of these people to talk to me about what they're doing, that they think like all press is good press, and that potential future clients will see that. And even if they see that they were effective in doing something terrible or helping clients who did something terrible, the thing that will stick with them is effective.
Right. Let's talk about Hunter Biden a little bit more. He did seem to be playing on his name, of course, and connections, but without actually getting his dad to do stuff on behalf of his clients. Did you uncover any evidence that Joe Biden ever did intervene to help Hunter's business interests?
Well, not in that sort of cause and effect way. Yeah. But it is true that what Hunter Biden did was to try to he did find clients and business partners who were very much like in the crosshairs of U.S. government-backed anti-corruption initiatives, which during his father's vice presidency, his father oversaw. So like there was this overlap, and even if like Joe Biden wasn't directly intervening on behalf of the clients, because of Hunter Biden, his role in at least one instance, frankly, it was the Ukrainian story that became the subject of the first impeachment of Trump, that related to Hunter Biden's service on the board of this Ukrainian natural gas company that was corrupt. I mean, the U.S. government had long identified the oligarch who was the owner of this natural gas company as sort of a poster child of post-Soviet oligarchic corruption in Ukraine. He worked for the oligarch, worked in the government of the pro-Russian strongman president who Manafort helped elect, and Manafort worked for. So you see like the overlap there, and the U.S. wanted this guy investigated. And so this oligarch hired Hunter Biden because he thought, again, hearkening back to that oligarch sort of mindset, that post-Soviet mindset, that like, how can I get the U.S. off my back here? Oh, I can pay the son of the vice president who is pushing Ukrainian and British prosecutors to go after me, and that'll get the U.S. and the Ukrainians off my back. And while it wasn't like quite that clear, Joe Biden did actually push for the firing of a prosecutor who was not investigating, who was not pursuing any of these investigations, but particularly into this oligarch who owned the gas company. And Joe Biden, said, and it was consistent with U.S. policy, that like they wanted these investigations. So if it were to actually have worked out the way that like Joe Biden, intended, Joe Biden would have pushed for the firing of this prosecutor. A new prosecutor would have come in and actually investigated Hunter Biden's business. That sort of happened, but not really, because the new prosecutor ended up coming and actually sitting down with the lawyers for the oligarch and the gas company, who Hunter Biden had a role in recruiting, and settling these investigations. So like the company, Burisma is called, the Ukrainian natural gas company, actually what they wanted, and maybe it was sort of indirectly because of Joe Biden's intervention, but it's neither what the Republicans had tried during the impeachment hearings to use as their defense, this idea that like Joe Biden intervened on behalf of Hunter Biden to fire a prosecutor who was aggressively going after Hunter Biden's paymaster. That's wrong. But so too was the Democratic claim that, this prosecutor was not like, Burisma wanted this corrupt prosecutor to stay because he wasn't going after them. No, Burisma wanted the prosecutor gone as well, but for a different reason, because the prosecutor, in very typical Ukrainian corrupt criminal justice fashion, was dangling the threat of a possible investigation in order to elicit bribes from the oligarchs. So yes, Hunter Biden's paymaster did want that prosecutor gone. But again, not for the reasons that the Republicans say, not because the prosecutor was aggressively pursuing the oligarch. So I know that's a bit of a tangled web and a long way to answer the question about whether Joe Biden actually did anything expressly to help his son or his son's business partners. And I think the answer is mostly no, but it's a little more complicated than that.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
Right, and we all remember that whole story. Those of us who watched or covered the impeachment hearings, in that case, although for different reasons, their interests coincided. There was this confluence of interest. But a lot of times, these lobbyists are doing things that are absolutely opposed to U.S. foreign policy, at least professed U.S. foreign policy interests. Do they care? I mean, is it just all about the bottom line and the money? Is there any ideology ever here, or is it just mercenary?
I mean, to the extent that there is an ideology, and I've heard this from a number of them, including Manafort, including Robert Strick, it's the idea that it is in the U.S.'s interest to maintain an open channel of communication with even unsavory characters. And this is like a central conceit of the Trump doctrine, to the extent that there is one in foreign policy. Like, he talks to Kim Jong-un, he talks to Putin, and he's willing to say nice things about them and, potentially do deals with them. And I think there is an argument to be made that is, that can play a role that is helpful to the United States. And certainly Manafort did play that role in a way where he was like, it's become apparent now, it wasn't apparent at the time, that he was serving as like a back channel to the Reagan and Bush CIAs, and in a way that like the U.S. government would not feel comfortable doing. So like even Robert Strick, says that like, he was communicating. One of his big clients in the first Trump term was this Joseph Kabila, who was the longtime strongman president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and had overstayed his term, and the U.S. wanted him gone, and the U.S. had applied all these sanctions, and so the U.S. wasn't really talking to him, but Strick was, and Strick admits like, yeah, the U.S. doesn't think this is a good guy, but like, isn't it a good result for this guy to leave power, for the U.S. to have like an open channel of communication for him that results in him leaving power, which he ultimately did, although he's sort of remained a behind the scenes power broker and may still be pulling the strings in the DRC. But that's the argument that they make to justify this kind of work, even as some of them admit that, like, yeah, money is a big part of it. But to the extent that there's any sort of ideological rationale there, that's it.
Just want to remind people, if you have any questions, please put them in the YouTube chat, and we'll get to some of those in a few moments. But yeah, it does seem like the main goal seems to be ego and lavish lifestyle, make a lot of money, puff yourself up. That's the kind of person who's attracted to this work, or at least the ones who are high profile enough to be in your book.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's also like, I think another common character trait is like risk taking. This is not, there are plenty of lobbyists who make comfortable livings working for like safer clients, either domestic clients or like more allied foreign clients. And so when you get into the space where you're working for the type of characters who would be included in a book called Devil's Advocates, there is a certain amount of risk tolerance that is required. And that risk tolerance does come with oftentimes larger paydays because of the sort of toxic nature of some of these clients. So like Robert Strick, for example, like he talks about, he would work for, Vladimir Putin, he would work for Kim Jong-un. And in fact, some of his current clients are people who were executives at Rostec, the Russian government-linked arms manufacturing firm, who are on U.S. sanctions, and Strick is like trying to help get them off sanctions. So it's not exactly working for Putin, but it's not too far away from it.
So there's some nuanced moves that happen, but one of the central premises, I think, of your book is that, our government or its foreign policy positions is for sale. But is it really? I mean, can you point to specific things where they actually changed American foreign policy? I mean, most of the time it seems the best they get is an audience or the as I said before, the impression, illusion of influence, but not an actual shift in policy. I mean, are there
No.
many cases where that actually happens?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, they're not like the big ones on like war and peace, but they are on, continuing the flow of like U.S. military assistance, sometimes like billions of dollars worth to the Bahrainis, for example. There was like a move that was being pushed, to cut off arms sales to like any foreign regimes that were participating in the Yemeni civil war, including the Bahrainis, and Strick and some other lobbyists for Bahrain claim credit for like helping to kill the effort to stop the arms. So I'll give you another example. Just today, in my book, in the epilogue, I write about Rudy Giuliani going over to the Republic of Srpska, which is this autonomous, self-governing territory inside Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's like the Serbian territory. There's three territories. One is Croat, Bosnian,
Right.
and Serbian. And so there's this Republic of Srpska, and the president for a long time was this guy Milorad Dodik, who was just an unabashed Putin supporter and apologist, and he was making noises for a long time about withdrawing Srpska from the Dayton Accords, which is the U.S. brokered peace treaty that ended the civil war, that sectarian fighting in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. And this guy had been sanctioned by the U.S. government because of this, and because of what the U.S. government called a corruption regime around him. And so he was looking to get off sanctions, and he was looking to brush back the UN body or the UN affiliated body that was like overseeing the implementation of the Dayton Accords. So he brings Rudy Giuliani over there and does a podcast, and Rudy Giuliani, appears at a rally for him wearing a Make Srpska Great Again hat. And then subsequently he hires a bunch of other people, Rod Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois, who sort of like refashioned himself as a Trump acolyte, and other lobbyists and lawyers who have ties to Trump or represented Trump in various cases. And literally just today, the Treasury Department lifted all the sanctions. Now, would that have happened without the lobbying? I mean, this guy did make some concessions after recent court decisions that tried to oust him from the presidency. He stepped down kind of and appointed like an interim president who's basically had long been his number two. He's still the head of the party, but they pulled back from some of their the laws that they had passed that were intended to, lay the groundwork for a possible secession from the Dayton Accords. But there are like veteran foreign policy people who are looking at this news that just happened today that I wrote about for the New York Times and saying like, this is an example of the blatant transactionalism of the Trump administration, where foreign policy is actually for sale. This is not in the best interest of the U.S. or the U.S.'s purported, foreign policy imperatives in this part of the world.
A feather in the cap for Rudy Giuliani. Now he can jack up his fee. We haven't talked about him that much, but he's in this book a lot. Are there any other, I mean, that's incredible, but are there any other stories, vignettes you want to share about Rudy Giuliani? Because we talked a lot about Hunter Biden and about Paul Manafort, but not so much about Rudy.
Yeah, Rudy was really interesting to me, and I made him a main character because during the first Trump administration, he really became kind of an avatar for this rogue foreign policy that was sort of outsourced to cronies of Donald Trump. And I think we see that playing out in a big way this time around with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who of course was in the first administration, but was actually inside, and now he's outside, but he's doing business deals with some of the same parties in the Middle East that he's negotiating with on behalf of the Trump administration. So Rudy was interesting to me because I think he was like a precursor for all of that. And to understand sort of his entry point here and his sort of interest in this space, you have to go back, I think, to, before the first Trump administration. I mean, he, for many years after leaving the mayoralty of New York City, obviously like riding high as a hero who helped lead New York and the country and the world really, through the perilous period after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He was a really like hot commodity on the international speaking circuit and the consulting scene. Like all these foreign regimes and domestic clients really wanted to, like, they couldn't throw enough money at Rudy Giuliani, and so he was sort of on this circuit. He was operating in the same space that like Hunter Biden and Paul Manafort were, but he long sort of craved the spotlight and the relevance. And even as he was making a bunch of money, he was sort of slipping in relevance. And with the slide in relevance, I think his billing, his sort of marketability and earning power had sort of diminished. And so when Trump came along in 2015, and there weren't a whole lot of Republicans with any kind of stature who were willing to support him, Rudy saw this as a real opportunity for him and really threw in with Trump at a time when a lot of Republicans were holding their nose. And then even more than that, stuck by him during the campaign when there were all these outrages, including the seminal one being the Access Hollywood tape. Rudy went out and defended that on the Sunday shows. That earned him major credibility with Trump. And how Rudy envisioned taking advantage of this credibility and this cachet with Trump is he wanted to be Secretary of State. And he actually believed that his long experience going around the world collecting these huge paydays would position him to do so. And I think probably Trump, for his part, thought, yeah, that seems fine. But he had enough people around him, including Chris Christie, interestingly, who ran the first transition team, who told him, like, actually, like, these are major red flags. Like, you don't want Rudy going through a confirmation hearing in the Senate when a lot of this stuff is going to come out about his various and sundry foreign clients and paydays and business partners. So Rudy was like quite disappointed. He didn't get really anything. I mean, he got like sort of a token cybersecurity advisory role, but he felt jilted, and so he kind of fashioned this role for himself as like a shadow Secretary of State, where he went around the world, taking advantage of the perception, rightful in a lot of cases, that like he had Trump's ear and could convince him to take a given stance on behalf of, in sort of favor of someone who paid Rudy or against someone who Rudy's clients disliked and wanted to cause trouble for. And there are a number of examples of him, going straight to Trump in the Oval Office and urging like the dropping of a prosecution against like a Turkish gold trader who he was representing, and all manner of other examples like that. And I think this sort of like climaxed with the first impeachment, where Rudy was simultaneously like seeking business from some of these Ukrainian oligarchs and Ukrainian politicians while pressuring them on behalf of Trump to announce investigations into Hunter Biden and his work for this Ukrainian oligarch who we talked about earlier, and convince Trump to use the power of the presidency to try to bully Zelensky to effectuate this same result. That obviously backfired spectacularly, caused the first impeachment. I think was kind of the beginning of the end for Rudy, in the sense that there was the first investigation of him. The DOJ, actually, interestingly, the Southern District of New York, the office which he used to lead, was investigating him for potential violations of this Foreign Agents Registration Act for his work on behalf of these Ukrainian officials, while he was whispering in Trump's ear about Burisma and Hunter Biden and pressuring Zelensky. So Rudy, in that way, I think, was like an avatar for this type of activity, and in some ways laid the groundwork for some of the open transactionalism that we're seeing now with the Trump family and other people around Trump.
Let's take a couple of questions from our audience, people who are with us live. The first one is about transparency under the Trump administration. They'd like to know, are lobbyists still filing the required reports? And I assume they mean, in this case, the foreign agent ones. And are there still consequences from federal agencies if they don't? Is FARA being enforced?
Well, that's a great question, and it gets to an important anecdote and development that I also tucked into the epilogue of this book, but has really borne itself out since I finished the book, and that is that one of the first moves of Trump's Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who, by the way, was a foreign lobbyist for the state of Qatar, in not like years ago, but like in the year or maybe 2 years before she became Attorney General. And one of her first moves as Attorney General was to decriminalize the enforcement enforcement of this Foreign Agents Registration Act. That's not to say the act is null and void, but just that they are not going to allocate significant resources to prosecuting criminal violations of this act, and instead are going to focus on sort of treating it as like an advisory, mechanism to try to use DOJ resources to help people, encourage people to file these disclosure reports. And I think that, to the first part of the question, whether they're still filing them, I think that they are, but not necessarily with the same degree of rigor or consistency that we saw when this was a real priority of the Justice Department. Interestingly, it was sort of at its height, the enforcement of FARA during the first Trump administration. That was because Robert Mueller, the special counsel, was using FARA as a tool to prosecute people like Paul Manafort and other Trump cronies who are in the book, who got prosecuted under FARA, some successfully, some not. But I think the days of it being really FARA and the enforcement thereof striking fear into the hearts of a lot of these lobbyists is long gone. And the pendulum has swung back the other way to the point where now it's approaching more of a Wild West type of scenario where people and lobbyists and foreign interests are erring on the side of not filing if there's a question of like, is this, this is a gray area. Should we file? Should we not? They don't see the potential risk of not filing because there's not going to be a criminal case against them. So I think we're seeing more of like a laissez-faire attitude towards FARA than we did in years past.
Another question from our audience. The Indonesian president was heard on a hot mic recently asking Donald Trump if he could meet with the president's son, Eric. Now, in that case, he already was with the president himself. But what did that reveal to you?
Yeah, that revealed the incredibly blurry line, to the extent that there is any line anymore, between President Trump's business interest and his family's business interest and his role as president. In fact, the Trump Organization has a number of projects in Indonesia. And while we don't know the specifics of what the Indonesian prime minister was seeking, certainly that backdrop and that context cannot be ignored, nor can the fact that, this is like this occurred during in Egypt on the sidelines of this peace, the announcement of this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. So it's like Trump is sort of like wearing two hats in that scenario. Like there's no presidential justification for him setting up a meeting between his son and the Indonesian prime minister or anyone in Indonesia other than furthering the Trump Organization's business interests.
So, you talk a lot. Obviously, you're going to open a lot of eyes with this book. Or I assume you hope you do. But what reforms? I mean, as you point out very early in the book, FARA was created in the 30s. Or late 30s, and really nothing's changed since then, except that now Pam Bondi has decriminalized it and made enforcement a low priority. So it seems like from the government, the attitude has been, as long as you let us know what you're doing, that's enough. It's legal, just make sure you let us know. What do we need to do? What should we do? What reforms do you think we should see?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we certainly have seen a number of proposals, not a lot in the form of actual bills being introduced, but certainly during the campaign, the 2020 campaign, we saw a number of the candidates, including Joe Biden, but Elizabeth Warren most acutely and most forcefully arguing for banning foreign lobbying entirely. Trump, I mean, you alluded to Trump's calls for reducing the power of lobbying during his first campaign in 2016. And oftentimes, when these this is like an effective argument to make on the campaign trail, because these politicians and their consultants know that this is something that most Americans see as distasteful. It's yet another example of deep-pocketed interest being able to gain favor and get special treatment from the U.S. government in a way that regular people are not able to. And that's particularly, I think, noxious to people when it's a foreign interest that are doing it. So it makes sense that there would be calls to clamp down on it or even abolish it. But those calls calls often run into the cold reality of governing when people are in office, and that's not just because there are like other priorities, and you don't want to, for the most part, government reform initiatives tend to be lower down the agendas of an incoming administration when you're probably only going to get one or two big ticket items passed. They tend to focus on the Republican side on tax cuts, or the Democratic side on healthcare reform, or in the case of Biden, infrastructure spending, and so there is the sort of political dynamics, but then there's also the legal dynamics. I mean, lobbying and foreign lobbying are protected by the First Amendment. So, you gotta, maybe there's room for incremental reforms that could either heighten the disclosure requirements or clamp down on elements of the type of spending that can be done. But short of that, I don't think we're going to see a lot of progress. And in fact, if anything, we're seeing, the pendulum swinging further, not just because of Pam Bondi, but because of developments in the advocacy space that Farah just did not envision. This law from 1938 is not going to capture a foreign regime paying influencers to tweet about whatever, whether it's the Srpska issue that I was talking about, where a lot of the influencers were tweeting. And by the way, I should credit Rod Blagojevich. He was the only one. He would post these tweets, X post on X, and he would write under them like, "This is a paid communication of the Republic of Srpska subject to the Foreign Agents Registration," and he would disclose them. But for the most part, other people were not doing that, and we don't know if these people were being paid, and if they were, by whom. And so, the sort of technology and the innovations in this space have far outstripped any kind of regulatory regime's ability to capture them.
There are a lot of moments in this book where you say that something was not previously reported, or in a previously unreported meeting or email, or et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of them. How often did that happen as you were reporting this? And was there anything in particular, or maybe more than one, that really jumped out at you? You thought, whoa, nobody knows about this. This is quite a revelation.
Yeah, I was able to get like a bunch of documents and stuff. And this is like a common dynamic that we grapple with as reporters who are writing on a daily basis for a news outlet, but also trying to simultaneously write a book. And there's often criticism of like, why did you hold on to that for the book? Like, why didn't you report that in real time? And the simple truth is, as you know, like their information like becomes available, certainly through public records requests, which just proceed at like a glacial pace. And oftentimes you don't get the actual documents until well after the story for which you requested the documents is out of the news. And so what do you do with it? Well, you use it for reporting in a book. And so like, for instance, the public records request yielded a bunch of stuff about Hunter Biden's work on behalf of this Romanian oligarch, as well as on behalf of Burisma, where he did appear to be effectively like lobbying the U.S. government in a way that probably should have triggered a Foreign Agents Registration Act requirement. So those would be examples of things that were previously not reported. And then the other sort of strain that I can think of at the top of my head vis-a-vis documents that are sort of pride-free later is like when people have a particular thing that they're pursuing, and in some oftentimes in conjunction with partners, and then the thing is over, the deal is over, or they fall out with the partners, and suddenly they're willing to talk about and provide documents about things. So like, for instance, I got Rudy Giuliani's invoices for $2 million that he sent to the Bahraini government, and a $5 million contract proposal to help the Democratic Republic of Congo through an Israeli intelligence-linked company. So there are a number of things like that I think are revelatory, that really, the details that kind of put meat on the bones of things that like we think we know, but we don't really have the proof of until here again, they're out of the sort of white hot spotlight of the news of the day, and can be sort of resurfaced in a more backward looking analysis like a book.
Another question, probably our last one from the audience. I'll add to it a little bit, but we've seen the chilling effect that this administration is having on some media, on universities, on law firms. The question is, do you find sources less willing to talk to you, given Trump's efforts to seek revenge on critics and political opponents, and as we know, on journalists who report things he doesn't like?
Yeah, a little bit for sure, and it's I think less like sources not wanting to cooperate. In some ways, like sources want to cooperate more because
Right.
they're so offended and scared by what's going on, but they are more acutely sensitive to their fingerprints being detectable on things that they provide. So I think there's a lot more like information and operational security that goes into it, where whether it's something as simple as communications now occurring on Signal with disappearing messages, or just thinking through, or like getting a document, and a document that I would typically post, on either on the New York Times website or on my social media, and them being concerned like, oh, this document like could have a watermark. It's not just something as simple as like putting it through one of these apps that takes out the metadata and the author's name and whatever, but like actually like watermarks or something distinct about an invitation that was sent to one person versus another, that they're concerned. For instance, I'm writing right now about the ballroom that that the Trump is building on the where the East Wing of the White House once was, and I got a hold of some documents related to it. And people are like petrified, like, don't post this document. You don't even like quote from this document, because they believe that like Trump is, or that the people around Trump who are like raising the money for this might have like altered like individual invitations or pledge forms or whatever, such that like you may think that you've scrubbed their fingerprints from it, but they would actually be able to find it and then come after these sources in a way that they would be able to exact the type of retribution that the questioner was asking about here.
We're just about out of time, but since you brought up the ballroom, I know you've worked on that a little bit. You've got all these corporate interests and large donors paying for it. Trump says he'll cover the rest. Is there anything you've been able to report or that you want to share about how that process is going, and if it is in fact as the president's characterizing it?
Well, this story is still to come, so
Okay.
I would say stay tuned. Click on the New York Times either Friday or over the weekend, and you'll see our new reporting on it.
Well, we look forward to that. Maybe it'll be in the next book. You probably do a whole book just on the ballroom. This book
Totally.
is Devil's Advocates, the hidden story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payrolls of corrupt foreign interests. It's really a fascinating read, and I've really, really enjoyed it, and I think you will too if you pick it up. And just want to thank Kenneth P. Vogel, author of that book, for being with us. Thanks a lot, Ken. It was really great to talk with you.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks again to the Commonwealth Club.
Thanks for listening. Programs like this can be heard every weekend on Book TV, which airs on C-SPAN 2 television.